The wind was a lash across the barren plains, finding every gap in the splintered wood of the abandoned cabin. Alara huddled deeper into the pile of rags and thin blankets, the cold seeping into her bones like water into thirsty earth. Outside, the world was a canvas of brutal white and gray, snow piled high against the single warped door. It had been days since the last ember glowed in the makeshift hearth, days since the meager supplies had dwindled to nothing but dust and the memory of food. Her stomach ached with a dull, constant throb, a counterpoint to the sharper pangs of fear and despair that clawed at her heart. He had promised to return. Just a short trip to the nearest settlement, he'd said, for supplies, for help. But the days had stretched into a week, then two, and the silence of the cabin was now louder than the wind's howl. It screamed abandonment. It echoed her own foolish hope, her naive trust. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone in a vast, unforgiving wilderness that cared nothing for her plight. The few possessions she had clung to, remnants of a life that felt impossibly distant, offered no warmth, no comfort. A small, tarnished locket holding a picture of her parents. A worn Bible whose words offered no solace in this desolate landscape. The simple dress she wore, thin against the biting cold. She closed her eyes, trying to summon a flicker of warmth, a memory of sun on her face, of a gentle touch. But the cold was too absolute, the present too harsh. It seemed impossible to survive, a fragile bird trapped in a cage of ice and snow. Death felt close, a quiet whisper on the edge of consciousness, a release from the gnawing hunger and the crushing weight of solitude. A sudden, sharp sound jolted her from her torpor, a distinct crack from outside, different from the wind's endless moan. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird against her ribs. She froze, listening, every sense on high alert. Was it an animal? Or worse, fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the dull ache of hunger? She held her breath, straining to hear over the blood pounding in her ears. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the heavy creak of the snow underfoot. Someone was outside. A man, by the sound of his heavy tread. Who could it be? Not him, surely. Not after so long. Doubt warred with a desperate, foolish hope. The door groaned, pushed inward with effort, letting in a blast of frigid air and a swirl of snow. Alara scrambled back, pressing herself against the furthest wall, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate curiosity. Silhouetted against the swirling white outside was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, bundled in thick, worn furs and canvas. He stood for a moment, letting the door fall back into place with a thud, plunging the cabin back into dimness, lit only by the weak gray light filtering through the single, grimy window. He didn't speak, just stood there, silent, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. His face was obscured by a low-brimmed hat and the collar of his coat, but she could sense his presence, a heavy stillness that wasn't hostile, but cautious. He was a stranger, an unknown quantity in a world that had already taught her bitter lessons about trust. He carried a rifle slung over his shoulder and a pack that looked heavy with supplies. Her gaze fixed on the pack, and a wave of desperate, animal hunger washed over her, shaming her with its intensity. He remained silent, observing her huddled form, a silent sentinel against the raging storm outside. He took a step deeper into the cabin, his boots crunching on the frozen dirt floor. He moved with a quiet competence, shedding his outer layers near the door. Beneath the heavy coat, he wore simple, sturdy clothes, a thick woolen shirt, canvas trousers. He was lean and weathered, his face etched with lines that spoke of sun, wind, and hardship. His eyes, when he finally looked directly at her, were a startling blue, clear and steady, holding a depth she couldn't fathom. They held no judgment, no pity, just a quiet assessment. He didn't ask her name, didn't demand to know how she came to be here. He simply took a few more steps towards the cold hearth, knelt down, and began to clear the frozen ash. He worked with deliberate, economical movements, gathering bits of dry wood from a small, forgotten pile near the wall, which she had been too weak, too despairing, to find or use herself. He didn't look at her again, focused entirely on the task. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and assumptions. He was an intrusion, a disruption to the quiet surrender she had been sinking into, and his presence ignited a flicker of something she hadn't felt in days. Uncertainty, yes, but also a fragile, terrifying ember of hope. He struck a match, a sudden, brilliant flare in the gloom, and carefully coaxed a flame from the tinder. The small fire caught, hesitantly at first, then grew bolder, casting dancing shadows on the walls, pushing back the oppressive cold. The smell of burning would fill the cabin, a scent of life and warmth that made her dizzy. She watched him, still wary, but the gnawing cold was beginning to lose its absolute hold. He added larger pieces of wood, tending the fire with a quiet focus. Only when the flames were burning steadily did he finally turn his head towards her again. "You haven't had much to eat," he stated, his voice low and rough, like stones worn smooth by a river. It wasn't a question, just an observation, devoid of accusation or pity. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small, wrapped parcel. He tossed it gently towards her. It landed softly on the dirt floor a few feet away. "Hardtack and some dried meat," he said. "Not much, but it'll keep you going." He didn't urge her, didn't watch her expectantly. He simply returned to tending the fire, adding another log. Alara stared at the parcel, her heart hammering. Food. Real food. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, tearing at the wrapping with clumsy fingers. The hardtack was dry and brittle, the meat tough, but it was sustenance. She ate slowly, deliberately, forcing herself to chew, to savor the texture, the faint, salty taste. Each bite felt like a victory against the encroaching weakness. He still didn't look at her, allowing her this small act of survival in privacy. The fire crackled, the only sound in the cabin besides her quiet chewing. She finished the meager meal, feeling a faint warmth spread through her veins. The edge of the hunger had dulled, replaced by a fragile sense of relief. He had given her food without demanding anything, without asking questions. He was an enigma, this silent, capable man who had appeared out of the storm. He finally rose from the hearth, stretching slowly. He looked around the small cabin, his gaze lingering on the gaps in the walls, the drafty door, the thin accumulation of snow on the floor near the windows. "Place is barely a shelter," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He walked to the door, examined the hinges, the latch. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling the icy wind whistling through the cracks. Then, without a word, he went back to his pack and pulled out a roll of canvas and some tools. He spent the next hour working on the cabin, stuffing the cracks with rags he produced from his pack, nailing canvas over larger holes, reinforcing the door. He worked with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long experience. Alara watched him, fascinated and wary. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He wasn't demanding payment or explanation. He was simply fixing things, repairing the brokenness around them. As he worked, a little more of her fear began to recede, replaced by a hesitant curiosity. Who was this man? Why was he here? He didn't seem like a settler or a trapper. He had the look of someone who belonged on the move, comfortable with solitude and hardship. He finished his work as dusk began to settle, plunging the cabin into deeper shadows outside the firelight's reach. The wind's howl was less piercing now, the drafts significantly reduced. The small space felt warmer, more secure than it had in weeks. He gathered his tools, put away the remaining canvas. He didn't speak. He just sat back down by the fire, leaning against the wall, his knees drawn up, his rifle resting across his lap. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not empty and despairing, but heavy with his presence, with the unspoken connection forged by shared space and quiet actions. Alara hugged her knees, watching him, a myriad of questions swirling in her mind. But she didn't ask them. He had given her warmth and food and shelter. For now, that was enough. Trust was a fragile, foreign concept, but perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't entirely impossible. The night settled, the fire casting dancing patterns, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she might see the dawn. The stranger, John, as he had finally introduced himself with a curt nod the previous evening, remained a man of few words. He woke before dawn, stirred the fire back to life, and silently prepared a simple meal of coffee and dried rations he shared with her. There was no awkward conversation, no probing questions about her past or how she came to be abandoned. He treated her with a quiet respect that was both unsettling and comforting. He didn't look at her with pity, nor with the suspicion she had come to expect from strangers. His eyes were steady, observing the world around him with a calm vigilance. He spent his days hunting, checking traps he set nearby, always moving with a practiced grace and economy of motion. He brought back small game rabbits, a squirrel which he expertly cleaned and cooked over the fire, sharing the meager bounty. Alara, hesitant at first, began to help in small ways. She gathered dry branches for the fire within sight of the cabin, careful not to stray too far. She fetched water from a partially frozen stream nearby, breaking the ice with a rock. John didn't ask her to, didn't thank her. He simply accepted her contributions with that same quiet acknowledgement. Through these shared tasks, a silent rhythm developed between them. She learned to anticipate his needs, having water ready when he returned from hunting, keeping the fire strong when he was gone. He, in turn, seemed to sense when she was struggling with a task and would quietly step in to help, his large hands capable and efficient. Trust wasn't built on words, but on these small acts of mutual reliance in the face of the relentless wilderness. She saw his strength, his resourcefulness, the quiet competence that had kept him alive out here. He saw. She wasn't sure what he saw in her. Weakness, perhaps, but also, she hoped, a flicker of the resilience she fought to maintain. One evening, as the fire cast long shadows, he finally spoke more than a few sentences at a time. He didn't talk about himself, but about the land, the harshness of the winters, the fleeting beauty of the summers, the signs of the coming spring he looked for. He spoke of the distances between settlements, the dangers of travel. His voice was low and measured, like the steady beat of a drum. He spoke of things she had only read about in books, the realities of this raw, untamed territory. He didn't ask about her past, didn't pry into the circumstances that led her here. He simply acknowledged her presence, offering glimpses into his world, the world of survival. It was a silent offering of acceptance, a gentle widening of the space he allowed her within his solitary existence. As the weeks passed, the snow began to recede, slowly revealing the frozen earth beneath. The air lost some of its biting edge, though the nights remained cold. The landscape transformed from a brutal white expanse to a muddy, thawing world. Alara felt her own strength returning, little by little. The constant ache of hunger was gone, replaced by the normal ebb and flow of appetite. The despair that had threatened to consume her had receded, held at bay by the simple necessity of survival and the quiet, steady presence of John. She still didn't know where she would go, what she would do. The future remained uncertain, a vast, uncharted territory as intimidating as the plains themselves. But the immediate threat of death by exposure and starvation had passed. She owed that to John. One afternoon, while John was out hunting, she heard the distant sound of horses. Her blood ran cold. She recognized the sound, the rhythm of riders who knew the land. Not John. She scrambled to the window, peering out cautiously. 3 men, mounted on sturdy horses, were approaching the cabin. They weren't settlers. They had a rough, swaggering air, and her stomach tightened with dread. One of them was Miles, the man who had brought her here, the man who had left her. Her heart leaped into her throat, not with relief, but with a cold dread. He was back, and he hadn't come alone. The other 2 men were strangers, their faces hard and calculating. She knew instantly this wasn't a rescue. This was something else, something dangerous. She retreated from the window, her mind racing. They would assume she was dead or weak and helpless. They didn't know about John. She glanced towards the hearth, towards the simple tools John used. Her hand instinctively went to a small, heavy piece of firewood. The fragile peace she had found was shattered, replaced by the stark reality of a new threat. She had faced the wilderness and starvation. Now she faced the cruelty of men. She heard their voices outside, rough and loud, then the sound of the door being pushed open. She stood frozen, hidden in the deeper shadows at the back of the cabin, the piece of wood clutched in her hand. Miles's voice was the first she heard, colder and harder than she remembered. "Figured she'd be dead by now," he sneered. "Saved us the trouble," a chuckle from one of the others. "Shame," the second man said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "Could have been useful," the third man grunted. "Waste of time. Just get what he wanted." Alara understood then. They weren't here for her. They were here for something Miles believed was in the cabin, something he had left behind, something valuable enough to bring him back through the thawing wilderness, with companions. The piece of wood felt inadequate, useless against these men. Just as they took a step further into the cabin, their eyes adjusting to the dim light, a voice cut through the air, quiet but carrying the weight of steel. "Hold it right there." John stood in the doorway, having returned silently on moccasined feet. He wasn't carrying his rifle, but a large, wickedly sharp hunting knife was in his hand, held casually at his side. His blue eyes, usually calm, held a dangerous glint. He was covered in mud and blood from a successful hunt, a skinned rabbit hanging from his belt. He looked less like a man and more like a creature of the wilderness, dangerous and unpredictable. The three men froze, clearly not expecting him. Miles's face twisted in surprise, then anger. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled. "This don't concern you, old man." John didn't respond verbally. He simply shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on Miles. The air crackled with tension. The other two men exchanged nervous glances, their hands hovering near their weapons. They hadn't anticipated a defender. And John, despite his quiet demeanor, radiated an aura of quiet menace. He wasn't looking at Alara, but she knew with absolute certainty that his presence, his stance, was for her protection. He was placing himself between her and these men. The man who had been left to die, who had given her food and warmth and silent companionship, was now facing down the one who had abandoned her. The injustice of it, the sheer cruelty of Miles's return and his callous assumption of her death, surged through her, stronger than fear. She tightened her grip on the wood. Miles recovered his composure, though his eyes remained narrowed. "Step aside," he ordered. "We got business here." John didn't move. "Your business is with me now," John said, his voice still low, but with an edge that promised violence. The largest of Miles's companions drew a pistol, its barrel glinting dully in the firelight. "You ain't in a position to make demands, old man," he sneered. Before the man could level the weapon, John moved. Not with a rush, but with a swift, economic motion. The hunting knife arced, catching the light. The man cried out, dropping the pistol as blood bloomed on his hand. John didn't pause, stepping into the space between the stunned men. Miles instinctively reached for his own weapon. Chaos erupted. The cabin, so recently a place of quiet survival, became a scene of brutal, close-quarters combat. John fought with a surprising speed and ferocity, using the knife and his hands with practiced skill. The men were bigger, but he was faster, drawing on an animalistic instinct forged by years of living on the edge. Alara watched, paralyzed for only a second. Then the rage that had simmered within her since Miles's return ignited. This wasn't just about John. This was about her survival, her dignity. She wasn't that helpless woman huddled in the corner anymore. With a cry, she lunged forward, swinging the piece of wood with all her might, hitting Miles squarely in the back of the head just as he was drawing his gun. He staggered, dropping his weapon with a clatter. The surprise on his face was instantaneous, followed by a flash of disbelief that she, the woman he had abandoned, would fight back. The distraction was enough. John disarmed the second man with a swift, brutal movement, incapacitating him. Miles, recovering from the blow, lunged at Alara, rage contorting his features. But John was there, a blur of motion, tackling Miles to the ground. The fight was short and brutal. John was relentless, fueled by a quiet protectiveness that was terrifying to behold. Within minutes, it was over. The three men were subdued, two nursing painful injuries, Miles lying groaning on the floor, defeated. John stood over them, knife still in hand, his chest heaving slightly. He looked at Alara, a question in his steady blue eyes, perhaps surprise at her intervention. She dropped the piece of wood, her hands shaking, but her gaze met his, steady and resolute. She wasn't the same woman he had found weeks ago. Silence fell again, heavy with the aftermath of violence. The fire crackled merrily, oblivious to the struggle that had just taken place. John bound the men's hands with rope from his pack. He didn't kill them, but left them wounded and humiliated. "You'll make it back," he said, his voice cold. "And you'll know what happens if you ever come near here again." He retrieved their weapons, tossing them into the snow far from the cabin. He then turned to Alara. He didn't say thank you, didn't praise her for her bravery. He simply looked at her, a long, measuring look. He saw the tremor in her hands, but also the newfound strength in her eyes, the set of her jaw. He saw the woman who had faced down despair and fought back against her past. Later, after he had ensured the men were gone and wouldn't be returning soon, he returned to the cabin. The quiet returned, but it was a different kind of quiet. A shared silence, weighted with mutual understanding and respect. He sat by the fire again, cleaning his knife with a methodical precision. Alara sat opposite him, feeling the last vestiges of fear drain away, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice soft in the stillness. "Why did you stay? Why did you help me?" He finished cleaning the knife before answering, looking into the flames. "Didn't seem right," he said simply. "Leave someone alone out here." It was a simple explanation, devoid of grand pronouncements, but it held more weight than 1,000 eloquent speeches. He saw a person in need and acted. That was his way. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, the fire their only companion. The cabin, once a symbol of abandonment and despair, felt different now. It was a sanctuary they had defended together, a place where she had found not only survival but also a strength she hadn't known she possessed. He had been the catalyst, the quiet, steady presence that had pulled her back from the brink. But the transformation had been her own. She had faced the harshness of the world, both natural and human, and had not broken. She had found resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The next morning, the sun rose, weak but present, a promise of warmer days. John packed his gear, preparing to move on. He was a man of the trails, not meant to be tied down. Alara watched him, a lump forming in her throat. He had saved her life, shown her kindness, helped her find her strength. He had appeared like a solitary star in her darkest night. He finished packing, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and turned to face her. He didn't offer her a place by his side, didn't make promises of a future together. That wasn't their story. Their connection was forged in shared hardship, a quiet understanding that transcended words. "You'll be all right now," he said, his voice gentle for the first time. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the strength he had seen in her. Alara met his gaze, her heart full of a quiet emotion she couldn't name. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be all right." The plain still stretched before her, vast and challenging, but she no longer felt utterly alone. She carried within her the memory of fire in the darkness, of shared food, of quiet protection, and of her own hand striking a blow against injustice. She had faced her fear and found courage. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Maybe," he said, his gaze drifting towards the horizon. "I'll see you down the trail sometime." It wasn't a promise, but a possibility, a quiet acknowledgement that their paths had crossed and left an indelible mark. He turned and walked towards the door, stepping out into the morning light. Alara watched him go, a solitary figure walking towards the unknown. As he disappeared from view, She turned back to the cabin, to the life she had to build. It wouldn't be easy, but she had survived. She had found her strength. And she knew now that even in the most desolate places, hope could take root, and unexpected connections could blossom in the harshest soil. The journey was far from over, but she would face it, not as a victim of circumstances, but as a survivor, resilient and ready for whatever lay ahead.